watch this to keep a different hour on Sundays. The hour when I sit with Nona and forget which stories belong to which decade. Aurelio smiled with the corner of his mouth reserved for tasks that are not tasks, but companionship disguised as work. Lina arrived with strawberries in a paper bag that leaked small suns, hair braided for weather that could not decide which instrument to play first. He showed her the watch, the rosemary, the request that sounded like a door held open with a football carrying soup. Sunday hour, she murmured. We can set a lane that the minutes enjoy walking slowly, like market aisles where tomatoes greet neighbors. They opened the back, found a mainspring that remembered salt kitchens, found dust that had the decency to be romantic, and brought both into present tense with oil and patient air. Aurelio drew a tiny mark on the regulator, a careful syllable in the alphabet of balance, then set a thin brass tab he had shaped years ago for the day a letter like this would arrive. When the crown is pulled to the first click on Sundays, the escapement will favor the longer path, he said, so the hour extends itself by grace, not by theft. Lina pressed the rosemary into the indigo felt, its scent rising like a well-remembered chorus in a small church. They sent the package with a note, a drawing of how to find the first click, and a recipe card that ended, as always, serve when the room's breathing matches yours. At midday, the bell rang twice by accident, and Amara tumbled in with her case and a program printed on paper that smelled faintly of ink and nerves. I play a small hall next week, she said, and I need the metronome to teach me how to bow to an audience without bowing to fear. Aurelio set the metronome to 72, then removed the bell so the click became more companion than conductor, and Lina turned the sign to soon so the afternoon could be all rehearsal and tea. They practiced bows the way one practices breathing, with kindness for lungs that forget timing when hearts get ambitious. Marabo to an empty chair first, then to a row of travel clocks, then to the kettle, which accepted with steam. 72, she whispered, and the room kept the count as if counting were a lullaby. In late afternoon, a boy peered around the door with a wind-up toy clutched like a passport, hesitant, hopeful. It used to walk in small circles, he said. Now it forgets where legs are. Aurelio knelt at the counter's edge, opened the tin turtle, and showed the boy the spring, the gears, the axle that needed the softest nudge. They wound it together, placed it on the floor and watched it draw a neat circle like a moon learning handwriting. The boy laughed in a key the shop liked and left a sticker on the door that read gently open, which is the best kind of instruction. Evenings they walked, Lina and Aurelio, along streets that had learned not to rush them, and sometimes they spoke of Mateo as if he had just stepped out to fetch oranges. Grief wore its better coat now, less scratchy, more wool that remembers shoulders, and it sat at a polite distance and less invited closer. One such walk brought them to a square where a public clock had aged into stubbornness, its face mottled, its chime tardy, its hands unsure whether noon deserved gesture. A maintenance worker stood on a ladder frowning gently, the frown of a professional who likes winning but prefers cooperation. "May I?" Aurelio asked, and the worker shrugged in the international language of "Be my guest if this becomes a story." He listened through the metal as doctors once listened through wood, and heard pigeons arguing about grammar inside the bell housing, dust offering its autobiography, the escapement whispering that it would love a chair. With a small felt wedge and a line of graphite, he built the idea of seating where the verge met the wheel, and the public clock cleared its throat, apologized to the square, and chimed the noon that made cafes pour coffee with dignity. The worker laughed, shook its head, and handed Aurelio a patch that read municipal kindness, which Lina insisted he sew inside his coat where only needed things live. Weeks folded like letters answered on time, and one blue morning a package arrived from the Rosemary Watch's sender. A photo of Nana in a shawl patterned like crossword puzzles, smiling in a Sunday hour that had chosen to stay for a second cup. "Keep the sprig," the note said. "We learned that time grows flavor when you let it simmer." Aurelio pressed the photo inside the notebook beside the sentence about benches, and drew a small rosemary leaf above the margin like a bookmark for kindness. On an evening Rain rehearsed, Adrian returned wearing a coat that had learned humility from drizzle, hands empty of cases, eyes quiet, springs, levers, a balance like a coin deciding whether to land on grief or going on. All lay quiet, but now dead, only waiting for someone to ask a better question. He placed 2 fingers lightly on the plate, let the beating in his own wrist become the metronome, and the gear train answered with a tremor that felt strangely like recognition. Aurelio Marin had a gift he did not advertise, the sort that does not look good in a shop window, the sort that makes you step back from parties. When he wound a clock for the first time, he tasted the moment that had stopped as surely as a sommelier tastes whether in a wine, the room, the season, the word said too loudly or not at all. He tasted Sunday, the lemon cleaner on a table, the kettle that did not whistle, and a doorbell's single circle of insistence. He found 2 teeth on the third wheel worn not by friction, but by a hesitation that had been fed for years, the way ivy eats stone in slow cursive. He cleaned the teeth with a brush of sable and stubbornness, polished the pivots with paper so fine it claimed to be air, and aligned the palate so the escapement could forgive itself for being a gate. When he let the balance go, the clock ticked twice, then refused, like a widow at the threshold of a dance hall, trying not to apologize for staying. Where is the chair for the promise? He asked the empty shop, and the empty shop, as it often does, answered by becoming less empty. He drew the notebook from the drawer, the one with the leather cover rubbed shiny in the corners, and opened to a page headed with a line he had written on a night when the clock said all paused like this. If time will not pass a threshold, build the threshold a bench. He looked around for wood, found a scrap of walnut the size of a laugh, planed it with a file until it was thin enough to be mistaken for kindness, and slipped it where the case met the plate, a wedge no thicker than certainty. The balance trembled, then began, a steady tick that felt like a small room learning to breathe again. He set the hands to 12:04, which is the minute he has always chosen when he wants time to believe it is new. The night folded its edges, and the rain finished speaking. By morning, the mantel clock kept time with the humility of a person back at work after a funeral, and Aurelio brewed coffee so gentle it apologized for being hot. The bell rang at 10, and Lina stepped in with that same careful arrival, as if she hated to interrupt the act of keeping. It runs, she said, not asking, knowing by the way the shop had chosen a tempo. It runs, he agreed, but there is still the promise, and I don't know where you want it to sit. She looked at the clock the way you look at a photograph you didn't take, and reached for the key. Aurelio placed his hand over hers, not to stop, but to ask the room to slow the camera. Tea, he said, or coffee, or the truth, if it's ready. She laughed again, and the second hand on the nearest wall clock skipped happily, a child hopping chalk squares. Coffee, she said, truth after. sauce that made even lies taste domestic, and she told him about the Sunday and the man named Mateo who made omelets like apologies that came before the harm, and the long illness that had taught them to count afternoons instead of years. When he closed his eyes, Lina said, "The clock made a sound like stepping off a bus in the wrong neighborhood. Rude and very final." Aurelio inclined his head the way carpenters do when admiring a joint that should have split and somehow did not. "He promised me he would not make me late for anything ever again," she said, and I think the clock believed him too literally. Aurelio let silence take its seat, and the silence behaved, folding its hands in its lap. "What do you want your time to do now?" he asked. "Not tomorrow, not next year, now." Lina stared at the mantel clock until the reflection of her face in the glass lined up with the Roman numerals in a way that looked like a new alphabet. "I wanted to keep him close enough to hear the kettle when it finally sings," she said, "and far enough that I can cross the street without bringing him to the other side." Aurelio nodded, because some orders cannot be written on paper, only on air. "Leave it for one more night," he said. "I'll set a chair at the half hour and a window at the quarter. You'll only have to open whichever suits the day." She narrowed her eyes, the way people do when testing a bridge with their foot. "All right," Lina said, and pinned a note to herself in her phone, because paper had been unfaithful lately. When she laughed, the bell rang the same single vowel, and outside the rain decided to study elsewhere. Aurelio set to work, not with screwdrivers first, but with chalk and a small brass compass that had once belonged to his mother, who could make flour keep time well enough for bread to arrive exactly when it was needed. On the backboard of the case he drew two small arcs, one at the half, one at the quarter, and inscribed in each the same untranslatable symbol his mother had embroidered into his winter scarf the year the river froze and refused to admit it. He oiled sparingly, like someone salting advice. Never more than needed, never in the wrong kitchen. At midnight, the city's clocks paused again, and this time Aurelio paused with him, a courtesy. On the second intake of the city's breath, he whispered into the mantel clock a sentence in a language peers remember from when they were stiller, and let the balance fall. Tick, tock, and then a third sound, soft as linen being folded, weaving itself between the two. In the morning, Lina returned with no umbrella and the intention intention to buy one if this guy insisted. Aurelio presented the clock the way a waiter places a plate he cares about, and she rested her palm on the mahogany as if testing the temperature of a bath drawn for a bravery she had postponed. At the half, he said, "It will open a chair for your promise to sit, and you can talk to him while the minute hand lingers. At the quarter, it will open a window, and you can wave without being waved back." Lina closed her eyes, and the second hand made itself small to avoid interrupting. "Show me," she said. Aurelio set the hands to 29, then nudged them to 30, and the shop filled with the faintest impression of a chair scraping politely across an unseen floor. Lina lifted her head, eyes wet the way good rain wets stone, evenly, with patience. "Hi, love," she said into the little room that the half hour made, and the word love arranged everything in the shop so dust did not settle for a moment out of respect. When the minute pushed on, the chair folded itself, and the clocks all pretended not to have been lessening. "How much?" she asked, reaching for her purse. "Bring me a kettle that sings," Aurelio said, "and a promise that does not turn to burr." She tried to argue, but the price was perfect, and you do not haggle with perfection, only accept it while it is still in stock. She left with the clock. The bell rung twice by accident, meaning luck, or at least timing. For 3 weeks, Lina appeared in the doorway every other day, sometimes to ask for oil, sometimes to return with scones that did not apologize for butter, sometimes to stand in the smell of lemon oil and name the hours she dreaded. They learned the same jokes, which is to say, they learned which silences wanted company, and which wanted to be left to do their work. On a Tuesday that began with brass a little brighter than usual, she placed a new navy-wrapped bundle on the counter, smaller, square, and too light to be grief alone. "A kitchen timer," she said. "It ticks loudly, and in the evenings my rooms get shy." He turned the aluminum shell in his hands, the numbers cheerful and round. The pointer scuffed as though someone had tried to rub away a particular quarter hour. "What do you want it to measure?" he asked. "It will do minutes regardless, but it helps if it thinks it's doing them for a reason." "Courage," she said. So quickly he looked up, and then she laughed at herself for speaking the truth before checking its label. Aurelio wound the spring to 10, set the timer on the bench, and placed beside it a coffee mug turned upside down like a drum. When it rings, he said, you will turn the cup upright, and whatever courage has condensed in the rim will be enough for the next 10. She eyed him for the trick, found none but faith, and nodded. The timer ticked, a little too proud of itself, and in those 10 minutes they talked about Mateo's omelets, about the way sunsets in this city prefer brick, about how clocks in waiting rooms often lie so gently you forgive them for keeping you brave. When it rang, she turned the cup, and there was nothing visible, yet she breathed differently, the way people breathe when they remember a window in a room they thought had none. That night, in her kitchen, the timer measured boiling water and also the time between then and the moment she realized she had not looked at the chair at the half for 3 hours. The kettle sang, not loudly, but in a key that fit her hand. She returned the next day with the singing kettle, placed it on the counter as payment, and the shop took a grateful breath that smelled for a second like steam and new porcelain. Keep it here, she said, for the afternoons when tea makes repair easier, or repair makes tea easier. He wanted to say something that would not rust, found only thank you, which rarely rusts when used with care. By the time spring rewrote the city's air, Lina and Aurelio had learned each other's pace, the length of hallways between question and answer, and which doors to leave open because some tools like to feel included. One evening, just after the shop had chosen its softer light, Lina stayed as he closed, and they listened to all the clocks attempt a consensus about night. Would you walk with me? She asked, at the hour when the city holds its breath. He looked at the door, at the blind, at the bench, at the kettle, and hung the sign to say soon. They walked along the river where the bridges like to pretend they were violin bows, pulling a music from water patient enough to be strings. Lina stopped beside a lamp that had learned to be kind to moths, and turned toward him with the steadiness of a person counting out loud for a friend learning to jump. I don't want time to hurry us, she said, and I don't want it to stall. Aurelio took her left hand, the one with the tiny scar below the thumb that matched his imposition if not the reason, and pressed his palm to hers. Then we let it keep us, he said, like a book you don't finish, because finishing is not the point. Somewhere far behind them, a clock struck the hour with the gentle confidence of a choir that has practiced in kitchens, and the city did not pause this time. images turned to shadows, and the river took the color of ink diluted by patience. Aurelio stopped at a railing worn smooth by evenings like this, and Lina leaned beside him, both of them listening to traffic draw soft lines on the far bank as if a pencil had learned restraint. "What did you want to do before clocks?" she asked, voice low, careful with the dark. "Or did you always want to mend seconds for a living?" He considered, the way a craftsman considers a drawer whose handle has never once squeaked, and then he smiled, a smile that preferred corners to fireworks. "I wanted to build a bell that never rang unless someone needed courage," he said, "so it would be mostly silent and very faithful." Lina's laughter passed through the lamplight like warm tea through china. Thin walls, a larger comfort. "Maybe you already did," she said, glancing at the hand still nestled in his, "and forgot to sign your work." He looked at their joined hands as if they were two gears newly meshed, surprised by how little polishing they required, and let the silence ring on their behalf. They turned back when the lamps softened to a more domestic glow, streets gleaming as if the city had just washed its face with rain kept warm for this purpose alone. At the shop door the bell restrained itself, then gave a single syllable of welcome in spite of restraint. Inside, the clocks held their better posture, tidy as hymnals on a shelf after a service that ended in good weather. Lina touched the mantel clock's polished flank in passing, not to test, only to greet, and the minute hand behaved like a dog that has learned sit in a generous home. "Tomorrow," she said, "I bring time bread, and the timer that measures courage gets a holiday." "Tomorrow," he agreed, and the bell blessed the plan by not ringing as she left, which is a deeper kind of consent. When he was alone, Aurelio reset a travel clock with a case like a wallet, listening to the small stubborn ticks that sound like people clearing throats before speaking honestly. The room breathed the way workshops breathe after a good day. Nothing racing, everything finishing the sentence it had already started, and he wrote in his notebook a single line. "If two hands are held at the hour, let the minute be the bridge." In the weeks that followed, the city practiced a new habit, pausing for a breath at unremarkable times. 2:17, 9:03, without explanation. People called it the soft second, used it to put down grocery bags without bruising fruit, to kiss a forehead without waking its thoughts, to name a worry and leave it outside like an umbrella. possibly a clockmaker who kept poor track of miracles, and a woman who brought scones that refused to apologize. On a Thursday, a man in a charcoal coat entered Aurelio's shop, the sort of coat that pays attention to itself, and set down a travel case longer than his forearm, narrower than his patience. Adrian Vale, he said without waiting to be asked. Antiquarian, collector, occasional patron of neglected excellence. Aurelio inclined his head in the diplomatic angle used by men who repair both watches and talk. I've heard about your half-hour chairs, Adrian continued, the smiles in his brass foil. I'm here to purchase one for a piece that refuses to behave. We don't sell chairs, Aurelio answered, gentle as oil. We build the idea of a chair where time wants to sit. Adrian's gaze flicked across the wall of clocks as daylight flicks across a pond, noticing everything, admiring very little. He opened the case, revealing a ship's chronometer older than most arguments, brass dealt to the color of stern honey, gimbal rings exhausted but proud. It stopped at sea, he said, and refuses the shore. Aurelio leaned in, the loop breathing a circle of clarity onto the dial, and tasted salt, rope, and an argument with weather that had not conceded but had grown tired of winning. Leave it with me, he said, and leave me your patience as deposit. Adrian chuckled in the key of a coin flip for show. I collect patience as well, he said. Tragically, it is frequently counterfeit. He signed, laughed, and the bell revised his exit into something less definitive. Lina arrived before noon with time bread as promised, and the shop smelled briefly like a bakery that respected clocks. A collector, she said, after listening to the story, which rarely means collector of ease. He wants a chair for a sea that still believes in waves, Aurelio replied, turning the chronometer so the light found scratches that told truth without boasting. They worked together, Lina holding tiny bottles, Aurelio aligning the balance, both of them letting their pulses teach the old sea how to hear land without becoming it. When the chronometer ticked at last, it did so with a sailor's courtesy, steady, alert, prepared to disagree politely with storms. Leave it on the bench overnight, Aurelio said. I want to hear whether it keeps shore time when the city holds its breath at 2:17. They ate time bread at the back table, crumbs making small matters Closing, Aurelio wrote again in the notebook, a list of benches he had built that were not wood, not brass, but clarity arranged into places where fear could sit without knowing. He did not notice the shadow outside the blind, the patient shape of a coat that counts the seconds until the lock repeats itself. Night drooped kindly, and the soft second arrived at 9:03, sliding its palm across the city's brow, soothing the crease that commerce draws. At 2:17, the chronometer took a breath with everything else, then resumed, a sailor stepping back onto deck after tying a line more carefully than before. Morning brought Hadrian veiled with a smile that had rehearsed for mirrors. "It keeps," Aurelio said, placing the instrument on felt as if returning a borrowed child. "But it will always pause when the city does. Consider it courtesy, not defect." Adrian's gaze narrowed, measuring what cannot be sold as an accessory. "What do you charge for teaching a city to breathe in unison?" he asked, the joke borrowing a chair from a thread. "Bread and a singing kettle," Lina said from the doorway, her tone mild, her stance unamused. Adrian accepted the chronometer, receipts made, coin exchanged, and left a business card that smelled faintly of cedar and intuition. After he was gone, Lina turned the card over, finding only a phone number and the suggestion of a crest that did not wish to be certain. "Keep it," Aurelio said, "for the drawer where things learn to be less important." Spring deepened into the forgetting green of streets that have remembered trees, and the soft second began to appear in places like bus stations, courtrooms, elevators before doors parted, letting strangers choose kindness as if it were a jacket they could share. The shop grew busier, and Aurelio found his ribs tiring the way bell ropes do on a festival day, dignified, stretched, not broken. One afternoon, the mantel clock arrived without Lina, carried by a courier who wore the uniform of polite pretexts. "Instruction inside," the courier said, then vanished as if the message weighed more than his shoes could bear. A note lay beneath the clock's beat, written in Lina's straight hand. "If he must sit, let him sit at the quarter today. I will wave through the window. Then I will cross the street alone and buy plums." Aurelio sent the hands to the quarter, opened the window that was not a window, and stood with the clock while the minute learned composure. At the precise softening of the second, he felt a breeze enter that had known Lina's kitchen, saw in imagination a doorway, a raised hand, a smile practiced for bravery, and then the window closed with a kindness that did not erase. He sent the clock back the same hour, with a spare key and a card that read in small letters, "Plums are improved by company, even if that company arrives later." Evening brought Lina herself, hair wind-tossed, eyes bright with a sort of peace that had negotiated hard and fairly. "I crossed alone," she said, placing 2 paper bags on the counter, one of plums, one of small screws and felt pads, because she knows stores the way he knows ours. "Me the plums," he said. "We'll tell them tomorrow is a festival." They shared tea, and the shop's light fell across brass in a way that made years look like well-kept promises. The festival did come, not of plums, but of clocks, a city tradition resurrected from a pamphlet Adrian would later claim to have loaned the mayor. Stalls lined the square. Children wore paper crowns shaped like crowns again, and old men debated escapements with a fervor normally reserved for football. Aurelio's booth displayed humble pieces, travel clocks, kitchen timers, a metronome that apologized by playing quieter when tapped, and Lina stood at his side with a basket of time dressed like confetti. At noon, the mayor lifted a ceremonial key so ornate it refused to fit anything, and declared a city-wide soft second on purpose. When it arrived, you could see shoulders drop as if a collective bang had found the floor. Laughter choose not to be allowed. Kisses be given room. Aurelio felt something in his chest release a knot he had not meant to keep, and Lina's fingers brushed his in the exact interval the second allowed. Permission shaped like touch. Adrian watched from a respectable distance, his smile adjusting its polish, his hands joined behind his back as if handcuffed by silk. After the festival, talk rose in the city like steam about who owned a pause, who could license the hush, where their courtesy could be patented. A letter arrived on stiff paper asking Aurelio to demonstrate his method to a board with a seal that liked to stamp itself. He set the letter beneath a paperweight shaped like a sleeping lion, the lion wearing dust as a kind of crown, and looked at Lina. "Do we explain?" he asked, "or do we continue quietly until explaining becomes redundant?" "Bread doesn't explain," she said. "It rises, it feeds, it lets others speak on its behalf when plates are empty." He smiled, relief spreading across his shoulders like a shawl someone else had thought to bring. They did not attend the board, and the city learned to keep the soft second without minutes of instruction, which is how most tender habits prefer to propagate. Summer arrived with long evenings that discovered patience in alleys usually reserved for impatience, and the shop store learned to open half a second earlier for people who needed it. Lina began to leave the mantel clock at home more often, its chair prepared for the days when memory asked to sit without taking over the room, and on other days the chair went unused, which is not the same as unneeded. They found a rhythm, mornings of screws and lemon oil, afternoons of tea and templates, evenings of walking the river's grammar. One night a storm approached wearing manners at first, then forgetting them, rain tapping the windows with knuckles that preferred doors. The soft second did not come at 9:03, nor at 2:17, nor at any of its usual shy haunts. Clocks kept a brave face, thunder kept loud company, and somewhere in the city a power station considered the cost of honesty. Aurelio felt the knout return, a rope across his chest he knew by name but never addressed, and he reached for the kettle because water knows how to talk to storms. Lina caught his wrist gently, shook her head once, and lifted the kitchen timer instead. 10 minutes, she said, cup upside down, courage collects, then we pour. They sat on the floor behind the counter like children who have declared a fort without moving furniture, backs against the wood, timer ticking with cheerful audacity. At 8 minutes, lightning stitched to seem so bright that even the brass blinked, and the storm forgot for a moment why it had come. At 9:30, the soft second arrived, shy, late, carrying its shoes, and the storm stood aside to let it pass, embarrassed to have been loud. When the timer rang, Lina flipped the cup, and courage tasted like warm porcelain that remembers hands. Thunder walked away muttering apologies into its collar. Rain followed like a friend who intends to make sure apologies reach their destination. Aurelio breathed, the knot releasing into smaller knots that surrendered in turn, and he pressed his forehead lightly to Lina's temple as one does to say thank you without alarming words. Days calmed, and summer learned to move aside for early autumn in the doorways of bakeries and bookshops, trading recipes in low voices. Adrian returned once, asked about licensing again, left again with the politeness of a man who has not yet realized the conversation ended before it began. The city never chose a board for the soft second, because it preferred to pretend it had invented itself, and perhaps it had, with help. One evening, Lina arrived with a small parcel wrapped in newsprint, edges square, weight promising paper. From Matteo, she said quietly, a stack of recipes he was embarrassed to write down because he cooked them better by listening. They unfolded the pages at the back table, the ink a little faint, the handwriting not proud, and found that every ingredient list ended with the same line. Serve when the room's breathing matches yours. They looked at each other and did not need the soft second, because some permissions carry their own clocks. Aurelio copied the line into his notebook beneath the earlier sentence about benches, and drew a small bell beside it that would ring only for courage, which is to say, mostly never, and very faithfully. Outside, the river practiced the long sentence it tells at night. Bridges held their violin bows steady, and somewhere a kettle chose key. They closed the blind, set the bell to soon again, and kept the hour together as if it were a book worth not finishing. Autumn arrived as if someone had opened a drawer of copper leaves and let them breathe, and the city practiced wearing scarves without deciding who had invented the habit first. Aurelio hung a sign in the shop window carved into thin walnut, not letters, but the outline of a teacup with steam in the shape of a triple clef, a promise that repair would proceed at the speed of kindness. People began to pause at the glass when the soft second visited, not to buy, only to agree with the window about the weather of their day, and continue lighter by the weight of a breath. One morning brought a girl with a satchel full of pencils, hair clipped back with a metal clasp that had not learned subtlety, shoes that squeaked like honest opinions. "I'm Mara," she declared, setting a metronome on the counter, its wooden pyramid scuffed at the corners. "I'm auditioning to be brave, and it clicks like it's judging me." Lina grinned from the back table where she was trimming felt pads into circles perfect enough to make geometry blush, and Aurelio tilted the metronome toward the light. "What tempo argues with your hands?" he asked, because hands are usually right about these matters. Mara briefed, counted in her head, and said, 72, but my teacher says 84 so the hall won't get bored. Aurelio set the pendulum to 72, wound gently, and the click softened. No longer a judge, only a companion who counts out loud so your fear doesn't have to. Hall can learn patience, Lina said, offering a slice of time bread wrapped in paper. Bravery prefers 72. Mara left with a sweater finally chosen, and the doorbell rang 3 small notes that made the metronome stand up straighter. Not all days were gentle, because cities require weather of character, and one afternoon a man burst in with a clock that had learned shouting from its owner. "Fix it now," he said, thumping the case onto felt like felt were an anvil. "It loses 5 minutes every day, and my work does not tolerate humility." Aurelio steadied the case with fingertips, looked at Lina, and she set the kettle to sing because kettles know how to speak to impatience without learning its accent. "It loses," Aurelio repeated softly, opening the bag. "Or is the day taking something it needs?" 5 minutes is theft, the man snapped, tapping his wrist as if the watch lifter were to blame. Aurelio examined the pendulum leader, found a bent where none should be, and a smudge of grit that had no reason except hurry. He straightened the leader with the tenderness of a librarian mending a favorite spine, cleaned the pivot, and set the beat. "Tea," Lina offered the man, and he took it as if cups were contracts, standing at an angle that apologized to no one. When the clock found its pace, the shop eased, and the man's shoulders dropped the distance of 5 minutes, which turned out to be the weight of a single breath taken properly. "How much?" he asked, less iron in the voice, more linen. "Practice pausing when the city does," Aurelio said, "and bring back the cup when you are ready for it to belong to someone else." The man nodded once, surprised to be included in his own afternoon, and left carrying less argument than he brought. In October, a letter arrived with no return address, paper thick as expectation, seal pressed with a crest that refused to be specific. Aurelio slid it with a blade whose handle had known his hand so long it chose where to rest without asking. "We request your attendance at the Meridian Club," it read, "to discuss matters of synchronized urban courtesy, compensation commensurate with influence, discretion required as though it were virtue." Lina looked up from polishing the singing kettle's spout, mouth tilted, eyes bright with a kind of laughter that does not interrupt until invited. "Adrian," she said, not asking. "Adrian," Aurelio agreed, and set the letter beneath the sleeping lion again, because lions enjoy continuity. They went, not to be persuaded, but to be polite, because politeness is a tool that refuses rust if used correctly. The Meridian Club lived in a building that collected chandeliers waters the way tide pools collect secrets, each crystal drop doing its best impression of the raindrop that knew expensive people. Adrian greeted them with both hands visible, smile polished, eyes cataloging. "Friends," he said, "because sometimes the shortest lies try the hardest. We wish to sponsor your work in bringing order to the city's pauses." "Pauses don't require order," Lina replied, pleasantly. "They require room." Adrian's smile attenuated. "Room can be provided," he said, "in exchange for branding, alignment, and a schedule." Aurelio studied the inlaid floor, a compass rose rendered in woods that had never met in the forest, and saw there the quiet folly of forcing agreement. "Scheduling mercy," he murmured, "is like bottling fog for export." A board member cleared his throat in the international language of decisions made elsewhere. "We will proceed regardless," he said. "The city enjoys its moment of harmony. We shall provide more, predictably, profitably." Mina set the singing kettle on the polished table as one might place a candle at a vigil, poured hot water into a cup that had not expected such humility, and the room filled with the scent of patience choosing a key. "Drink," she said, "then decide if the pause should wear a logo." They drank, some out of courtesy, some out of curiosity, and a silence arrived that did not belong to any of them, and yet everyone felt improved by carrying it. Adrian set down his cup first, looked at the crust and the wax on the letter he had sent, and sighed the sigh of the man who knows when a room has chosen a different story. "Very well," he said, "softer, realer, let the pause remain unowned." They walked home along streets that had decided to keep them, and the city allowed them a private soft second at a crosswalk where no cars came, not because of rules, but because of luck and attention. Winter wrote its first sentence on the shop window. A feather of frost had practiced calligraphy until morning, and Aurelio wrapped the kettle in a knitted sleeve so it would not feel alone between cups. Work changed with the season. Heavier clocks, slower oil, customers who told longer stories because darkness extends honesty. A woman brought a cuckoo clock whose bird refused to appear, not from shyness, but from principle. "It will not interrupt the evenings now that I read to my father," she explained. "I think it has decided books are sacred." Aurelio adjusted the strike to the minutes between chapters, taught the bird to whisper instead of call, his notebook. Not all interruptions are either. Some are invitations. Lina spent afternoons copying Mateo's recipes onto cards sturdy enough to survive kitchens that laugh, and each card ended, as the original said, with the line about the room's breathing, which customers began to repeat as if it had always been their family's custom. Snow arrived on a Tuesday with the modesty of confetti swept into corners after a kind party, and rain appeared at the door carrying a violin case and a grin that had rehearsed for this entrance. I passed to audition at 72, Mara announced behind Bryn, cheeks bright with winter, the holler and patience, and so did I. This shop became a room that knew many names, not just customer or neighbor, but witness, and the clocks seemed to stand an inch higher as if posture were contagious. One late evening, when Snow muttered to sidewalks about the virtues of softness, a little brass alarm clock limped in from the cold in the pocket of a student with ink on his fingers and a lost look on his week. It rings at the wrong time to wake me, he said, but the right time to make me cry. Aurelio wound the key, listened, and heard in the spring the sound of a mother's kitchen in another country, a window with steam flowers, a radio speaking a language that believes bread deserves news. He set the alarm to the soft second nearest dawn, and taught the bell to ring like a spoon against a cup in a room where someone loves you without scheduling it. The student slept, woke, and returned with eyes that had learned their own patience. What do I owe? He asked, hand already in his pocket where coins fidget. Write what you know about mornings onto a card, for the drawer where advice becomes recipes, Lina said, and he wrote, breakfast is not a time, but a permission. By midwinter, Adrian's name appeared less often in rumors about ownership of pauses, and more often in rumors about a man who had once considered owning weather and now bought umbrellas to give away in rain. He returned to the shop with his chronometer swaddled like a content infant, stood awkwardly near the kettle, and cleared his throat in the language of apologies that hoped to be accepted before fully spoken. I'm learning to be a patron of interruptions that make room, he said, eyes on the floor. May I fund benches for thresholds in buildings that confuse rush with purpose. Lina poured tea. Aurelio nodded, and the kettle sang a small note that sounded like paperwork agreeing to be brief. They made a list, not of addresses, but of rooms that would breathe better with a chair, court foyers, bus depots, hospital corridors where midnight likes to linger, and Adrian took the list as if entrusted with a sleeping taught a school's master clock to smile at recess, which is to say he added a minute that refused to be counted and insisted on being played. On the night the city shifted its hour to give evening more light, the soft second arrived early, then on time, then late on purpose so everyone would practice being kind to the person they became at different minutes. "Do you ever want to leave?" Lina asked as they closed shutters that saw more than they admitted. "Not us, not this, but the city's story." Aurelio considered the streets that had taught him to hear, the river that tuned his breath, the kettle that had learned 100 names for tea, and smiled with the portion of his mouth reserved for confessions. "Sometimes," he said, "but then someone walks in with a clock that believes in chairs, and I remember I am still building the bell that only rings for courage." Lina slid her palm into his, and their joined hands made a bridge that did not hurry feet, and certainly did not stall them. They left the sign to soon, turned the lamp slow, and stepped into a night that had set places for them at a table of small weather and honest roads. In the room behind their ribs, the city kept its breath like a promise kept lightly, and all the clocks agreed to disagree in harmony, which is the best kind of keeping. Spring unbuttoned the city one blossom at a time, and pavements learn how to carry sunlight without showing off. Aurelio opened the shock to air that smelled of wet brick and early bread, and the faint metallic hope of bicycles. On the counter waited a parcel wrapped in craft paper, string-tied with the competence of someone who has wrapped many gifts, even when days did not propose celebration. He cut the twine, lifted the lid, and found inside a pocket watch seated on indigo felt beside a folded letter and a pressed sprig of rosemary. The watch was older than most regrets, case worn smooth by honest pockets, crystal faintly clouded the way windows remember long winters. He turned it in the light, and the hinge sighed a practiced sigh, the kind that forgives before asked. The letter bore careful handwriting that did not hurry the ends of its lines. "Please, if you can, teach this to keep a different hour on Sundays. The hour when I sit with Nona and forget which stories belong to which decade." Aurelio smiled with a corner of his mouth reserved for tasks that are not tasks, but companionship disguised as work. Lina arrived with strawberries in a paper bag that leaked small suns, hair braided for weather that could not decide which instrument to play first. He showed her the watch, the rosemary, the request that sounded like a door held open with a football carrying soup. "Sunday hour," she murmured, said Elaine that the minutes enjoy walking slowly, like market aisles where tomatoes greet neighbors. They opened the back, found a mainspring that remembered salt kitchens, found dust that had the decency to be romantic, and brought both into present tense with oil and patient air. Aurelio drew a tiny mark on the regulator, a careful syllable in the alphabet of balance, then said a thin brass tab he had shaped years ago for the day a letter like this would arrive. When the crown is pulled to the first click on Sundays, the escapement will favor the longer path, he said, so the hour extends itself by grace, not by theft. Lina pressed the rosemary into the indigo felt, its scent rising like a well-remembered chorus in a small church. They sent the package with a note, a drawing of how to find the first click, and a recipe card that ended, as always, serve when the room's breathing matches yours. At midday, the bell rang twice by accident, and Amara tumbled in with her case and a program printed on paper that smelled faintly of ink and nerves. I play a small hall next week, she said, and I need the metronome to teach me how to bow to an audience without bowing to fear. Aurelio set the metronome to 72, then removed the bell so the click became more companion than conductor, and Lina turned the sign to soon so the afternoon could be all rehearsal and tea. They practiced bows the way one practices breathing, with kindness for lungs that forget timing when hearts get ambitious. Marabo to an empty chair first, then to a row of travel clocks, then to the kettle, which accepted with steam. 72, she whispered, and the room kept the count as if counting were a lullaby. In late afternoon, a boy peered around the door with a wind-up toy clutched like a passport, hesitant, hopeful. It used to walk in small circles, he said. Now it forgets where legs are. Aurelio knelt at the counter's edge, opened the tin turtle, and showed the boy the spring, the gears, the axle that needed the softest nudge. They wound it together, placed it on the floor, and watched it draw in each circle like a moon learning handwriting. The boy laughed in a key the shop liked, and left a sticker on the door that read gently open, which is the best kind of instruction. Evenings they walked, Lina and Aurelio, along streets that had learned not to rush them, and sometimes they spoke of Mateo as if he had just stepped out to fetch oranges. Grief wore its better coat now, less scratchy, more wool that remembers shoulders, and it sat at a polite distance and less invited closer. One such walk brought them to a square where a public clock had aged into stubbornness, its base mottled, its chime tardy, its hands unsure whether noon deserved gesture. A maintenance worker stood on a ladder frowning gently, the frown of a professional who likes winning but prefers cooperation. "May I?" Aurelio asked, and the worker shrugged in the international language of "Be my guest if this becomes a story." He listened through the metal as doctors once listened through wood, and heard pigeons arguing about grammar inside the bell housing, dust offering its autobiography, the escapement whispering that it would love a chair. With a small felt wedge and a line of graphite, he built the idea of seating where the verge met the wheel, and the public clock cleared its throat, apologized to the square, and chimed the noon that made cafes pour coffee with dignity. The worker laughed, shook his head, and handed Aurelio a patch that read "Municipal Kindness," which Lina insisted he sew inside his coat where only needed things live. Weeks folded like letters answered on time, and one blue morning a package arrived from the Rosemary Watch's sender. A photo of Nona in a shawl patterned like crossword puzzles, smiling in a Sunday hour that had chosen to stay for a second cup. "Keep the sprig," the note said. "We learned that time grows flavor when you let it simmer." Aurelio pressed the photo inside the notebook beside the sentence about benches, and drew a small rosemary leaf above the margin like a bookmark for kindness. On an evening Rain rehearsed, Adrian returned wearing a coat that had learned humility from drizzle, hands empty of cases, eyes quieter. "I've been finding chairs in corridors," he said, "and I've discovered the pleasure of leaving plaques unnamed." Lina poured tea, and he accepted as if taking a vow with steam. "There is one more matter," he added. "A tower across the river. Its bell refuses dusk, as if evening owes it an apology." They crossed at twilight, bridges drawing bows again, water patient under their lesson, and found the tower with its shoulders up like a stubborn child at bath time. Inside, dust motes practiced waltzes in the light of windows that could not close. Ropes hung like retired snakes, and the bell waited with the patience of iron. Aurelio listened to the bell through his palm, and heard not refusal, but embarrassment, as if it had once rung at the wrong moment and now feared every moment. He showed Lina where Rust had written timid letters along the clapper, letters that spelled sorry in a dialect of metal. They cleaned, oiled, sanded only where patience asked, and Aurelio tied a narrow ribbon of leather near the clapper's throat so the first strike after silence would land on kindness. At dusk, he pulled the rope, and the bell gave a note that knew exactly how loud to be for a city that had learned to breathe. Adrian stood with his hands in his pockets, like a man who chooses pockets to prevent clapping loudly, and nodded once. "Thank you," he said to the air more than to them, which is where gratitude belongs when it is meant for many. Summer leaned over the horizon again, and the shop adopted longer afternoons in which tea brewed slower and screws refused to rush the threads. Mara's concert came and went, and afterward she placed a program on the countersign in pencil, 72 forever, and a small drawing of a metronome wearing the crown knitted of time. One noon, Lina arrived with a box that smelled of cardboard, sea, and ink from distant postmarks. "It's from Matteo's cousin," she said, "a bundle of his aprons. A note that reads, 'Maybe time can learn spices the way dough learns hands.'" They unfolded an apron, soft with work, and Lina tied it around Aurelio with a laugh that forgave his protest. He brewed tea that tasted faintly of basil by accident, and they decided accidents deserve recipes too, so they wrote one that ended, "Serve when you smile without noticing." In the late light, a quiet settled that was not absence, only attendants wearing comfortable shoes, and Aurelio reached for his notebook. He wrote, "If two people learn the city's breath together, their days acquire hinges that never squeak." Lina leaned on the counter, chin in palms, and watched him write with the fondness of someone reading a favorite paragraph again. "We could close on Sundays," she said, "not for rest exactly, but for walking at the speed of rosemary." He looked up, found her eyes already holding the answer, and nodded. They made a new sign, walnut again, carved with a cup and a sprig, and hung it with string that had carried bread once. On the first Sunday closed, they walked a map that did not exist on paper, a procession of benches they had midwifed into thresholds, hospitals that kept chairs ready for midnight, bus depots that learned to be patient with suitcases full of decisions. At each, they sat for a minute, listening to strangers breathe, leaving behind the smallest adjustment to air, like straightening a frame no one knew was crooked. By evening, the river told its long sentence again, and bridges kept time without insisting upon it. They stood beneath a lamp that remembered moths kindly, and Aurelio lifted her hand to his lips with a slowness that refused smiled, eyes bright as polished brass in kind weather, and stepped closer into the pause the city gifted without need of ordinance. When Monday woke, the shop smelled of sun-hung wood, and the first customer brought a clock that had survived a house move and needed someone to tell it the new walls were friendly. Aurelio set the case on felt, and as he worked he felt the old desire rise again, the bell that only rings for courage, mostly silent, very faithful. He looked at Lina, and she looked back with the certainty of a metronome set to the right heart, and he knew the bell already existed, not in brass, but in the soft second they had taught themselves to hear. Outside, the city exhaled, as if setting down a bag it had decided not to carry today, and 100 small clocks agreed to disagree with grace. Work resumed, kindness kept its appointment, and time, pleased to be trusted,